The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Northwestern University's graduation hall, casting golden patterns across the sea of black caps and gowns. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her mortarboard for the 100th time, her palms slightly damp with nervous excitement. At 22, she was about to become the first person in the Mitchell family to graduate from college, a milestone that felt both triumphant and surreal. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," the dean's voice boomed across the auditorium. As she walked across the stage, Sarah's eyes found her family in the third row. Her parents, David and Linda, were beaming with pride, her father wiping away tears he'd never admit to shedding. Her younger brother Jake was recording everything on his phone, probably for his TikTok. But it was her grandmother Rose who caught her attention. The 78-year-old woman who had raised Sarah's father after his own mother died young, who had babysat Sarah countless times, who had always believed in her granddaughter's potential, even when Sarah doubted herself. Rose was crying openly, her weathered hands pressed to her chest, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the Chicago humidity. She wore the same navy dress she'd worn to every important family event for the past decade, paired with the simple pearl earrings that were her only remaining jewelry. After the ceremony, the Mitchell family gathered at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse in downtown Chicago, a splurge that Sarah knew stretched her parents' budget. Her father worked as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant, and her mother cleaned offices at night to help make ends meet. This celebration was their way of honoring what they saw as a family victory. "I still can't believe our little girl is a college graduate," Linda said, raising her glass of wine. "With a degree in social work, no less. You're going to change the world, sweetheart." Sarah felt the familiar mix of pride and pressure that came with being the family's hope for upward mobility. She'd chosen social work not just because she wanted to help people, but because she'd seen firsthand how systems could fail families like hers. Families that worked hard, but never seemed to get ahead. "I couldn't have done it without all of you," Sarah said, looking around the table. "Especially you, Grandma Rose. You always believed I could do this, even when I wanted to drop out sophomore year." Rose's eyes crinkled with the kind of smile that had comforted Sarah through childhood's scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. "Oh, honey, I knew you had it in you from the day you were born. You've always been special. Remember when you used to help me with homework at your kitchen table?" Sarah laughed. "You'd make hot chocolate and tell me stories about the old neighborhood while I struggled with algebra." "Those were good times," Rose nodded, her voice carrying a note of something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Nostalgia mixed with something deeper, more complex. David raised his beer, to Sarah and to Mom Rose, who always told us education was the key to everything. As they clinked glasses, Rose's voice cut through the celebratory chatter with unexpected clarity. "I sold my jewelry for that." The table fell silent. The comment hung in the air like incense, heavy and lingering. Sarah looked at her grandmother, confused by the sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean, Grandma?" Rose's cheeks flushed pink, as if she'd spoken without thinking. "Oh, nothing, dear, just, I'm so proud of you. That's all that matters." But Sarah had caught something in her grandmother's expression, a flicker of pain, of resignation, of something unresolved. She glanced at her parents, who were exchanging a look she couldn't decipher. "Grandma, what jewelry did you sell?" Rose waved her hand dismissively, but her fingers trembled slightly. "Ancient history, sweetheart. Let's just enjoy your special day." The conversation moved on, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just been revealed and then quickly buried. Throughout the rest of the dinner, she found herself studying her grandmother's face, noting the absence of the rings that used to adorn her fingers, the missing brooch that had once been a constant fixture on her coat lapel. After dinner, as the family walked through downtown Chicago's bustling streets, Sarah fell into step beside her grandmother. The evening air was warm for May, carrying the sounds of the city. Car horns, distant music from restaurants, the chatter of other families celebrating their own milestones. "Grandma, about what you said earlier," Sarah, honey, some things are better left in the past. Rose's voice was gentle but firm. What matters is that you're here. You've accomplished something wonderful, and you have a bright future ahead of you. But Sarah had inherited her grandmother's stubbornness, along with her work ethic. You said you sold your jewelry for my education, but I never saw any money from that. My student loans, the financial aid, I kept track of everything. Rose stopped walking, her hand finding Sarah's arm. In the glow of the streetlights, Sarah could see her grandmother's face more clearly. The lines that spoke of decades of worry, the eyes that held secrets Sarah was only beginning to suspect existed. Sometimes, sweetheart, love works in ways that aren't always visible. That night, back in her childhood bedroom in the Mitchell family's modest bungalow in Cicero, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of her neighborhood. A dog barking in the distance, the occasional car passing by, the hum of the air conditioning unit her father had installed last summer. She thought about her grandmother's words, turning them over like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Rose had sold her jewelry. Sarah was sure of that now. The evidence had been there all along, the missing wedding ring that had been replaced by a simple band, the antique brooch that used to catch the light when Rose moved, the gold bracelet that had disappeared sometime during Sarah's sophomore year. But if the money from those sales was meant for Sarah's education, where had it gone? Her parents had been upfront about their financial struggles. They'd shown her the rejection letters from banks when they'd tried to get educational loans, had sat with her at the kitchen table filling out financial aid forms, had worked extra shifts to help cover what wasn't covered by grants and scholarships. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her roommate Jessica. "How was graduation? Did your family cry?" She typed back, "Dad totally cried, but something weird happened. I think there's some family drama I don't know about." "Ooh, family secrets. Tell me everything tomorrow. Too tired to text properly." Sarah set her phone aside and continued staring at the ceiling. In the morning, she'd have to start the job search in earnest, begin the process of becoming a real adult with real responsibilities. But tonight, she couldn't stop thinking about the look in her grandmother's eyes, the way her parents had gone quiet when Rose mentioned the jewelry. There was a story here, buried beneath years of family politeness and careful omissions. And Sarah Mitchell, newly minted social worker with a degree in uncovering the truth behind people's struggles, was determined to find out what it was. The last thing she saw before drifting off to sleep was the graduation photo her mother had placed on her dresser. Sarah in her cap and gown, surrounded by her family, everyone smiling except for Rose, whose expression held something that looked remarkably like relief mixed with sorrow. Tomorrow, Sarah decided, she would start asking the right questions. The next morning brought the kind of Chicago heat that makes concrete shimmer and turns the lakefront into a magnet for anyone seeking relief. Sarah woke to the smell of her mother's coffee and the sound of her father getting ready for work, the familiar rhythm of a family that had been grinding through economic uncertainty for as long as she could remember. In the kitchen, Linda was packing David's lunch with the methodical precision of someone who had been doing the same task for 23 years. Sarah's father sat at the small Formica table, scrolling through job postings on his phone while eating toast. "Morning, college graduate," he said without looking up. "How's it feel to be smarter than your old man?" "You're plenty smart, Dad. You just never had the chances I did." David looked up then, his expression serious. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. You had chances we made sure you got." There it was again, that careful emphasis, as if her parents were trying to communicate something without actually saying it. Sarah poured herself coffee and sat across from her father, studying his weathered face. At 51, David Mitchell looked older than his years, the kind of aging that comes from physical labor and financial stress. "Dad, yesterday Grandma Rose said something about selling her jewelry for my education. Do you know what she meant?" The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Linda stopped packing the lunch, her hands stilling on the sandwich wrapper. David set down his phone and looked directly at his daughter for the first time that morning. "Sarah, Your grandmother? She's always supported your education. We all have. That's not what I asked. Some conversations are private, honey, between adults. Sarah felt a familiar frustration bubble up, the same feeling she'd had throughout high school when she'd sensed her parents were protecting her from some financial crisis or family drama. I'm an adult now, Dad. I'm 22 years old with a college degree and student loans that I'll be paying off for the next decade. I think I can handle whatever it is you're not telling me. Linda finally turned around, her face conflicted. Sarah, your grandmother specifically asked us not to what? Sarah's voice rose slightly. Not to tell me the truth about how my education was paid for? David rubbed his forehead, a gesture Sarah recognized as his way of buying time when he was caught between competing loyalties. Look, sweetheart, the important thing is that you got your degree. How that happened? Well, families help each other in different ways. But I never received any money from Grandma Rose. I would have known. We went through every penny together, remember? All those nights at this table, calculating costs, figuring out how to make it work. Maybe the help came in ways you didn't see, Linda said quietly. Sarah stood up, her coffee untouched. I'm going to visit Grandma Rose today. I'm going to ask her directly. Sarah, David started. No, Dad. Something happened, something that involved her making a sacrifice for me, and I was never told about it. That's not okay. I have a right to know. An hour later, Sarah was driving through the familiar streets of her grandmother's neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side. Rose lived in a small but well-maintained frame house that she'd shared with Sarah's grandfather until his death 8 years ago. The neighborhood was a mix of working-class families who'd lived there for decades and younger couples who were slowly gentrifying the area. Rose's house stood out for its meticulous upkeep. Flower boxes in the windows, a front porch swept clean, a small garden where she grew tomatoes and herbs. It was the kind of place that whispered of pride maintained despite limited resources. Sarah knocked on the familiar screen door, hearing the sound of her grandmother's footsteps on the hardwood floors inside. Sarah, what a lovely surprise! Rose opened the door, but her eyes held wariness beneath the welcome. Come in, sweetheart. I was just making iced tea. The interior of Rose's house was a shrine to family history, photographs covering every available surface, furniture that had been carefully maintained for decades, doilies and decorative touches that spoke of a generation that believed in making a house into a home, regardless of budget constraints. Sarah accepted a glass of iced tea and settled into the same chair where she'd done homework as a child. Grandma, we need to talk about what you said yesterday. Rose's hand trembled slightly as she set down her own glass. Sarah, dear, I think you're making too much of an old woman's ramblings. You said you sold your jewelry for my education, but I never received any money from you. Where did that money go? For a long moment, Rose was quiet, her fingers worrying at the simple gold band that had replaced her original wedding set. Outside, Sarah could hear children playing in a nearby yard, their laughter a stark contrast to the tension in the small living room. Sometimes, Rose finally said, helping someone means more than just handing them money. What does that mean? Rose stood up, moving to the window that looked out over her small backyard. Your parents, they're proud people, Sarah. Too proud sometimes. When you were a sophomore and things got really tight, when your father was laid off for those 6 months, Sarah's stomach dropped. She remembered that period, the stress in the house, the whispered conversations between her parents, the way certain luxuries disappeared from their grocery shopping. But her parents had insisted they were fine, that Sarah should focus on her studies. They never told you they were behind on the mortgage, did they? What? 3 months behind? About to lose the house? Rose's voice was steady now, as if she'd decided to finally release a burden she'd been carrying. Your father was too proud to ask for help, and your mother was working double shifts just to keep food on the table. They were talking about you taking a leave from school, getting a job to help out. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. But they never said, of course they didn't. They wanted you to focus on your education, not worry about adult problems. But I knew that if you left school then, you might never go back. I'd seen it happen too many times in this neighborhood. So you sold your jewelry. Rose nodded slowly. My wedding ring, the original one with the diamonds your grandfather saved for months to buy. My mother's brooch, the one that came from Ireland with her family. A gold bracelet from my first anniversary. Some other pieces I'd collected over the years. How much? Enough to catch up the mortgage and keep you in school without you ever knowing there was a problem. Sarah set down her iced tea with shaking hands. Grandma, I gave the money to your parents with strict instructions that you were never to know. They didn't want to take it, fought me on it for weeks. But I told them it was either that or watch their daughter's dreams get crushed by circumstances beyond her control. The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. Everything she thought she knew about her college years, about her family's sacrifices, had been built on a foundation of protective lies. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have insisted on dropping out anyway. You would have felt guilty, responsible. You would have tried to get a job to pay me back instead of focusing on your studies. Rose turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I couldn't let that happen. You were too important. Your future was too important. Sarah stood up, needing to move, to process what she was hearing. But those pieces, they were all you had left of Grandpa, of your family history. No, sweetheart. Rose's voice was firm now. Those were just things. You, your education, your future, the opportunity to break the cycle that's kept this family struggling for generations. That's what mattered. That's what your grandfather would have wanted too. I can't accept this. I have to pay you back. With what? Your student loans? Your starting salary at whatever social work job you find? Rose's laugh was gentle but sad. Sarah, the gift was given freely. The only way you can honor it is by using your education to help people, to make the kind of difference in the world that someone with a high school diploma and a factory job could never make. Sarah sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her grandmother's sacrifice and her own ignorance of it. All this time I thought I'd done it on my own. I was so proud of making it work with just loans and grants and part-time jobs. You did do it on your own. You did the studying, the late nights, the stress of exams and papers. You earned every grade, every credit hour. I just smoothed out one bump in the road. A bump? Grandma, you sold your most precious possessions. Rose crossed the room and knelt beside Sarah's chair, taking her granddaughter's hands in her own weathered ones. Sarah, listen to me. Those rings and brooches, they were beautiful, and they held memories. But they were just metal and stones. You're alive, you're brilliant, you're going to help families who are struggling the same way we've struggled. That's worth more than any jewelry ever could be. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, her own young and soft from a life that hadn't yet required physical labor, her grandmother's marked by decades of cooking, cleaning, and caring for others. The contrast told the story of everything Rose had wanted to change about the family's trajectory. Does anyone else know? Your parents, of course, and your Aunt Margaret. I had to tell her when she asked why I wasn't wearing Mom's brooch anymore. Sarah thought of her father's sister, Margaret, who lived in Arizona and visited only occasionally. She'd always been the more prosperous branch of the family tree, married to an accountant, living in a suburb with a swimming pool. Had she known all along about Rose's sacrifice while Sarah remained oblivious? What did Aunt Margaret say? Rose's expression grew complicated. She had opinions about how I chose to spend my money. What kind of opinions? She thought I should have invested it or saved it for my own old age. Or Rose trailed off, but Sarah could fill in the blanks. Aunt Margaret had probably questioned the wisdom of liquidating family heirlooms for what she might have seen as a risky investment in Sarah's uncertain future. Did she offer to help instead? The silence that followed was answer enough. Sarah felt a new emotion building alongside her gratitude and shock, anger. Anger at herself for not knowing, anger at her parents for keeping the secret, anger at Aunt Margaret for judging rather than helping, and a fierce, protective anger on behalf of her grandmother, who had quietly sacrificed everything she treasured for her granddaughter's future. "Grandma, I don't know how to process this." "You don't have to process it all at once, sweetheart. Just use your degree, help people, make the world a little bit better. That's all the thanks I need." As Sarah drove home through the afternoon heat, her mind raced with questions and emotions she couldn't yet untangle. The familiar streets of her neighborhood looked different now, as if she were seeing them through new eyes. Every house held families with their own hidden struggles, their own quiet sacrifices, their own dreams deferred or pursued at great personal cost. Her phone rang as she pulled into her parents' driveway. It was Jessica, her college roommate. "Hey, how was the family drama investigation?" Sarah turned off the engine and sat in the car, staring at the house where she'd grown up, the house that had almost been lost while she was obliviously studying for midterms. "Jess, I need to ask you something. In all the time we lived together, all the conversations we had about money and student loans and our families, did I ever seem spoiled to you, like someone who had been sheltered from real problems?" "What? Sarah, you were the most financially aware person I knew. You worked more hours than anyone. You knew exactly how much everything cost. You stressed about money constantly. Why are you asking?" "I just found out that my family went through a major financial crisis during sophomore year, and I never knew about it. I feel like I was living in some kind of bubble." "Okay, first of all, that just means your parents are good parents who didn't want you to worry about things you couldn't control. Second, you weren't living in a bubble. You were living the life they wanted you to live, focused on your education instead of their problems. That's not spoiled, Sarah, that's loved." Sarah felt tears starting to blur her vision. "My grandmother sold her jewelry to help them through it. Her wedding ring, family heirlooms, and I never knew." "Oh, Sarah. I don't know how to feel about this. Grateful, guilty, angry, confused, everything all at once. Can I tell you something my therapist said to me once? Sometimes the hardest part of being loved is accepting that other people made sacrifices for you that you can't repay. The only thing you can do is honor those sacrifices by living a life worthy of them." As Sarah finally went inside to face her parents, Jessica's words echoed in her mind. She was beginning to understand that her graduation hadn't just marked the end of her college career. It had marked the beginning of her real education about the true cost of love, sacrifice, and the complex bonds that hold families together through even the most difficult times. The conversation with her parents would have to wait until her father came home from work, but Sarah knew that everything had changed. The story she'd told herself about her achievements, her independence, her self-reliance, was going to have to be rewritten to include the uncomfortable truth about grace, about the ways people are lifted up by others' sacrifices, whether they know it or not. That evening, the Mitchell family gathered around the dinner table with a tension that made the warm Chicago air feel even more stifling. Sarah had spent the afternoon pacing the house, rehearsing conversations with her parents, trying to organize her thoughts into something coherent. Now, faced with the reality of the discussion ahead, she felt unprepared for the emotional complexity of what needed to be said. Linda had made David's favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes, as if comfort food could somehow smooth over the discomfort of the conversation they all knew was coming. Jake, Sarah's 17-year-old brother, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, scrolling through his phone between bites and occasionally contributing random facts about whatever TikTok video had captured his attention. "Jake, put the phone away during dinner," Linda said automatically, her voice carrying more stress than usual. "Mom, I'm literally just phone away now." The sharpness in their mother's tone got Jake's attention. He looked around the table, finally noticing the way Sarah was staring at her food without eating, the way their father was cutting his meat with unusual precision, the way their mother kept glancing nervously between her husband and daughter. "Okay, what's going on? Did someone die or something?" "No one died," David said carefully. Your sister just has some questions about family finances. Sarah looked up from her untouched plate. I went to see Grandma Rose today. The fork slipped from Linda's hand, clattering against her plate with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. David set down his knife and folded his hands, the gesture of a man preparing for a difficult conversation he'd been dreading. She told me about the jewelry, Sarah continued, about the mortgage payments, about how you were 3 months behind during my sophomore year. Jake's head swiveled between his family members like he was watching a tennis match. What mortgage payments? What jewelry? That's what I'd like to know, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'd like to know why my entire family decided to keep me in the dark about a financial crisis that apparently threatened our home while I was away at school, blissfully unaware. David rubbed his forehead. That familiar gesture that Sarah now realized had appeared much more frequently during her sophomore year than she'd noticed at the time. Sarah, we made a decision to protect you from what? From reality? From the chance to help my own family? From derailing your education over a temporary problem? Linda said quietly. From making you feel responsible for fixing things you didn't break. Jake set down his fork completely now, his teenage bravado replaced by genuine concern. Wait, we almost lost the house? 6 months, David said, looking at his son. I was laid off for 6 months. The manufacturing plant downsized, eliminated my position. They brought me back eventually, but by then we were behind on everything. Mortgage, utilities, credit cards we'd used to keep going. Why didn't you tell us? Jake's voice cracked slightly on the question. Because you were 17 and worried about SATs and college applications, and your sister was in the middle of her most challenging semester. Linda's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Because we didn't want our financial problems to become your emotional burden. Sarah felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. But it wasn't just your problem, was it? It became Grandma Rose's problem when she had to sell her most precious possessions to save us. We fought her on that for weeks, David said, his voice thick with emotion. We begged her not to do it. We were looking into second mortgages, talking to banks, exploring every other option. But those options would have taken months to process, and we were running out of time, Linda added. The bank was starting foreclosure proceedings. Your grandmother, she acted before we could stop her. Sarah pushed back from the table, needing space to process the flood of information. So while I was studying for organic chemistry and worrying about whether I'd get into the social work program, Grandma Rose was at some pawn shop or jewelry store selling her wedding ring to keep our family from being homeless. She didn't go to a pawn shop, David said quietly. She found a reputable jewelry dealer downtown, someone who specialized in estate pieces. She researched it, made sure she got fair value. Fair value? Sarah's voice rose. Dad, those pieces were irreplaceable. They were her connection to Grandpa, to her own mother, to family history that went back generations. You think we don't know that? Linda's composure finally cracked, tears spilling over. You think we don't carry the weight of that sacrifice every single day? You think your father doesn't look in the mirror every morning and see a man who let his mother sell her jewelry to fix his mistakes? The raw pain in her mother's voice stopped Sarah's anger in its tracks. She looked at her father and saw something she'd never noticed before, a deep shame that he'd been carrying for years, the burden of a man who had been unable to provide for his family without his mother's intervention. Jake, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. But we're okay now, right? Dad got his job back. We're not losing the house anymore. We're stable, David said. But your grandmother's jewelry is gone forever. And Sarah's right. We made decisions about her life without telling her. We thought we were protecting her, but maybe we were just protecting ourselves from having to admit we'd failed. Sarah sat back down, the fight going out of her as she saw her family's pain more clearly. You didn't fail, Dad. The economy failed. The company failed. A system that doesn't protect working families failed. You didn't fail. Easy to say now, David replied. Harder to believe when you're 50 years old and your mother has to bail you out of trouble. Is that why you didn't want me to major in social work? Sarah asked suddenly, the connection clicking into place. Because you were afraid I'd end up struggling financially like you? Linda and David exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations that long-married couples have perfected. Partly, Linda admitted. We wanted you to have security, stability, a career that would protect you from the kind of crisis we went through. But I chose social work because of the kind of crisis you went through, Sarah said. Because I wanted to help families who face exactly these kinds of problems. The only difference is, now I know firsthand what those families are going through. Jake, who had been processing everything with the particular intensity of a teenager, discovering that adults don't have everything figured out, suddenly asked, "What about me? Are you going to keep secrets from me too when I go to college?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that her younger brother was grappling with the same sense of betrayal she felt, but also with the fear that his own future might be built on similar hidden sacrifices. "We won't keep secrets," David said firmly. "We've learned that protecting you from the truth doesn't actually protect you from anything. It just leaves you unprepared for reality." "Good," Jake said with the bluntness of youth. "Because I'd rather know if our family is struggling than walk around thinking everything is fine when it's not." Sarah looked at her brother with new respect. At 17, he was showing a maturity that she wasn't sure she'd possessed at 22. "There's something else," Linda said quietly. "Something we haven't told you about your Aunt Margaret." "What about her?" "When your grandmother told her what she was planning to do, selling the jewelry to help us, Margaret offered to lend us the money instead." Sarah felt a surge of relief. "That's great. So Grandma Rose didn't have to—" "She offered to lend it," David interrupted. "With interest and collateral. She wanted us to sign over the house as security for the loan." The relief died in Sarah's throat. "What?" "She said it was just business, that family loans needed to be formalized to avoid conflicts." "But the terms—" Linda shook her head. "If we'd missed even one payment, she could have foreclosed on us. We would have been trading one crisis for a potentially bigger one. So you chose Grandma Rose's gift over Aunt Margaret's loan." "Your grandmother made the choice for us," David said. "When she found out about Margaret's conditions, she went to the jewelry dealer that same day. She said she'd rather sell everything she owned than watch us tie ourselves to what she called predatory family lending." Sarah felt a new wave of anger, this time directed at her aunt. Margaret, who had always presented herself as the successful member of the family, who made subtle comments about her brother's choices and his lack of financial planning, had been willing to profit from their crisis rather than simply help. "Does Aunt Margaret know that Grandma Rose went through with selling the jewelry?" "Oh, she knows," Linda said with uncharacteristic bitterness. "She called your grandmother financially irresponsible and said she was enabling us by not letting us face the full consequences of our situation." "She said that to Grandma Rose?" "In front of the whole family at Christmas dinner that year," David said. "It's why we don't see much of Margaret anymore. Your grandmother told her that some people measure wealth in dollars and others measure it in the people they love. Then she asked Margaret to leave." Sarah tried to imagine that scene, her gentle, soft-spoken grandmother standing up to her more affluent, more educated daughter-in-law, defending her son's family against criticism from someone who had chosen judgment over generosity. "I wish I'd been there." "You were," Jake said suddenly. "Remember? You came home for Christmas break, and Aunt Margaret left early because she said she had a headache. But before she left, she and Grandma Rose had some kind of argument in the kitchen. You were helping Mom with dishes and missed it." The memory came flooding back, the tension in the house that Christmas, the way Aunt Margaret had seemed cold and distant, the way Grandma Rose had been unusually quiet during dinner. Sarah had attributed it to normal family stress, the kind of minor conflicts that arise when relatives spend too much time together. She'd had no idea she was witnessing the aftermath of a family crisis that had nearly destroyed everything she thought she knew about her own security. "I need to call Grandma Rose," Sarah said, standing up from the table. "Sarah!" David called after her. "What are you going to say?" She turned back to face her family, her parents who had carried the weight of protecting her from harsh realities, her brother who was just beginning to understand that adulthood meant grappling with complexity rather than simple answers. "I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to ask her what I can do to honor what she did for us." "You don't owe her anything," Linda said. "She made her choice freely." "That's exactly why I owe her everything," Sarah replied, "because she chose to give when she didn't have to, sacrificed what mattered to her for people she loved more than her possessions. That's not a debt that gets paid back with money. That's a debt that gets paid forward." As Sarah walked to her room to make the call, she thought about all the families she would meet in her career as a social worker. Families facing the same kinds of crises her own family had navigated in secret. She would meet grandmothers making impossible choices, parents lying awake at night, wondering how to keep their children's dreams alive while their own foundations crumbled, young people struggling under burdens they didn't know they carried. But now she would meet them with something she hadn't possessed a week ago, the knowledge that love often operates in the spaces between what is said and what is understood, that families survive not just on resources, but on the willingness of some members to sacrifice for others, and that sometimes the most profound gifts are the ones that remain hidden until the recipients are mature enough to bear the weight of gratitude they inspire. The conversation with Rose would be the beginning of a new relationship between them, one based on honesty rather than protection, on mutual respect rather than the old dynamic of adult shielding child from difficult truths. Sarah was ready for that relationship now, ready to be worthy of the sacrifices that had been made on her behalf, ready to build a life that honored not just her own dreams, but the dreams of the woman who had made them possible. As she dialed her grandmother's number, Sarah realized that her real education was just beginning. 3 months after graduation, Sarah sat in her new office at Chicago Family Services, reviewing case files and thinking about the conversation she'd had with her grandmother the night she learned about the jewelry. That phone call had lasted 3 hours, filled with tears, laughter, and the kind of honest communication that had been missing from their relationship for years. "I'm not angry that you didn't tell me," Sarah had said that night, her phone pressed against her ear as she curled up in her childhood bedroom. "I'm angry that I was so focused on my own struggles that I didn't see yours." "Sweetheart," Rose had replied, her voice warm with the kind of love that transcends generations. "That's exactly what we wanted. We wanted you to be young, to focus on your dreams, to believe that anything was possible. There's time enough for adult worries when you're actually an adult." Now, sitting in her cramped but hopeful office space, Sarah understood what her grandmother had meant. The case file open on her desk told a familiar story. The Rodriguez family, where 15-year-old Maria was struggling in school while her parents worked multiple jobs to keep their small apartment. The parents, Elena and Carlos, reminded Sarah painfully of her own. Hard-working, proud, determined to give their children opportunities they'd never had, but stretched so thin financially that every unexpected expense threatened to topple their carefully constructed stability. Sarah's supervisor, Janet Morrison, knocked on the open doorframe. Janet was a veteran social worker in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of calm competence that came from 2 decades of helping families navigate crisis after crisis. "How are you settling in?" Janet asked, stepping into the small office that Sarah shared with. "Another recent hire. Good, really good actually. I'm working on the Rodriguez case. Have you had a chance to review it?" Janet nodded, her expression serious. "Challenging situation. The parents are resistant to accepting assistance because they see it as charity rather than support. Very common in families who've been self-sufficient until circumstances beyond their control create crisis." "That sounds familiar," Sarah said, thinking of her father's initial refusal to accept help from Rose. "The key is helping them understand that accepting support isn't a failure of character. It's a recognition that everyone needs help sometimes, and that the goal is to get them to a place where they can help others in the future. As Janet left, Sarah found herself thinking about the circular nature of assistance, how her grandmother's sacrifice had enabled Sarah's education, which was now allowing her to help families like the Rodriguezes, who might someday be in a position to help others in turn. It was a web of interconnected support that extended far beyond any individual transaction. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Can you pick me up after school? Mum's working late and Dad's truck is in the shop." Sarah smiled, typing back, "Of course, I'll be there at 3:30. The relationship with her family had shifted since the revelations about Rose's sacrifice. There was more honesty now, more acknowledgement of their interdependence, less pretense that anyone was completely self-sufficient. Jake, in particular, had embraced this new transparency, asking direct questions about family finances and expressing interest in understanding how households actually worked beyond the sanitized version he'd been presented with as a child. That afternoon, as Sarah waited in the pickup line at Jake's high school, she watched other families navigating their own daily logistics, working parents juggling schedules, older siblings helping with transportation, grandparents stepping in where needed. Each car held its own story of cooperation and sacrifice, of adults making compromises to ensure that the younger generation had what they needed to succeed. Jake threw his backpack into the back seat and slumped into the passenger seat with the particular exhaustion of a teenager who just survived 7 hours of institutional education. "How was school?" Sarah asked, pulling out of the parking lot. Weird question from Ms. Peterson in AP History today. She asked us to think about how our families had contributed to our educational opportunities beyond just paying for things, like what sacrifices had been made that we might not be aware of. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What did you say?" "I talked about Grandma Rose, actually, about how she sold her jewelry to help keep us afloat during Dad's layoff, and how we didn't know about it at the time." Ms. Peterson said that was a perfect example of what she meant, that education is rarely just an individual achievement. How did that feel, talking about it? Jake was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the familiar streets of their neighborhood. Proud, I guess, and scared. Proud that Grandma Rose loved us that much, but scared about what might happen if we hit another crisis like that. What do you mean? She's older now, you know. She doesn't have any more jewelry to sell, and you're just starting your career, so you're not exactly rolling in money. If something happens to Dad's job again. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the anxiety that came with understanding just how precarious financial security could be, even for families who worked hard and made responsible choices. "Jake, do you remember what I told you about why I chose social work? Because you wanted to help families who were struggling. Partly, but also because I realized that individual families can't solve systemic problems alone. Grandma Rose's sacrifice brought us time and stability, but it didn't fix the underlying issues. The fact that Dad's job could disappear without warning, that healthcare is expensive, that college costs more than most families can reasonably afford. So what do we do about that?" Sarah pulled into their driveway, but neither of them made a move to get out of the car. This was the kind of conversation that needed to happen in a neutral space, somewhere between the public world and the intimacy of home. We work to change the systems that make families vulnerable in the first place. We vote for politicians who support working families. We advocate for policies that provide safety nets. We help each other when we can, and we accept help when we need it. And we remember what Grandma Rose did, so we can do the same for someone else someday. Sarah looked at her 17-year-old brother with amazement. Exactly. That evening, the Mitchell family had dinner at Rose's house, a tradition they'd started after the revelations about the jewelry. Rose had initially protested that she didn't need them to check on her, but Sarah had insisted that the dinners weren't about obligation. They were about choice, about actively deciding to prioritize family time in a way they'd taken for granted before. Rose had prepared her famous lasagna, the recipe that had been passed down from her own mother, and that filled the small house with the kind of warmth that made everyone speak a little more softly, laugh a little more easily. "I have news," Sarah announced as they were clearing the table. "I got my first paycheck today, and I want to do something with it. Please tell me you're not about to try to pay me back for the jewelry," Rose said with mock sternness. "We've had that conversation." "Not exactly. But I want to start a small fund, something we can all contribute to when we can, that could help if any of us faces an emergency. Nothing dramatic, just a little cushion, so that next time there's a crisis, the burden doesn't fall entirely on one person." David looked skeptical. "Sarah, you're just starting out. You need to focus on your own financial stability." "Dad, I learned something from Grandma Rose's example. Security isn't just about individual savings, it's about networks of support. If we all contribute what we can, when we can, then we're all more secure." Linda was nodding slowly. "Like a family emergency fund." "Exactly. Jake can contribute from his part-time job at the grocery store. You and Dad can add to it when you get overtime pay or bonuses. I'll put in whatever I can from my paychecks. And Grandma Rose," Sarah turned to her grandmother, "you contribute your wisdom about when and how to use it." Rose's eyes were bright with tears. "Sarah, sweetheart, that's a beautiful idea. But what if I'm the one who needs the help? I'm not getting any younger." "Then that's what the fund is for," Jake said simply. "You helped us when we needed it. Now we help you when you need it. That's how families work, right?" As they finished cleaning up, Sarah found herself standing in Rose's kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd done homework as a child, where Rose had made hot chocolate and told stories, where the decision to sell precious jewelry had probably been made during sleepless nights, when an elderly woman weighed her options and chose love over security. "Grandma," Sarah said quietly, "I want you to know that your sacrifice didn't just save our house. It taught me what love looks like when it's put into action." Rose dried her hands on a dish towel and turned to face her granddaughter. "Sarah, that jewelry, those were just things, beautiful things, meaningful things, but still just things. You, your education, your career helping families, the way you're thinking about taking care of all of us, that's the real treasure. That's what your grandfather and I dreamed about when we were young and struggling ourselves. I wish he could have seen me graduate." "Oh, sweetheart, he sees. Every family you help, every crisis you prevent, every time you choose generosity over self-protection, he sees all of it." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the community center where Chicago Family Services held its monthly support group for families facing financial crisis. The Rodriguez family was there, along with 8 other families at various stages of stability and struggle. Elena Rodriguez had found a better-paying job with benefits, and Maria's grades were improving now that she wasn't staying up late, worrying about whether her family would be evicted. "I want to share something that one of our families taught me," Sarah said to the group. "Sometimes people think that accepting help is a sign of weakness or failure. But I've learned that the strongest families are the ones who understand that we're all connected, that helping each other isn't charity, it's community." After the meeting, as Sarah was packing up her materials, Elena Rodriguez approached her. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to thank you for helping us navigate the rental assistance program, but more than that, I wanted to thank you for treating us with dignity throughout the process. You never needed my dignity, Elena. You had your own. I just helped you access resources that should have been easier to find in the first place. My mother in Mexico, she had to sell her gold earrings once to help us when Maria was born, and we had medical bills. I never understood why she cried when she came home from the jewelry store, even though she was happy to help us. Now I understand. Sometimes the hardest part of helping someone isn't the cost. It's watching them struggle when you wish you could do more." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her throat. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was, and she would have been proud to know that her sacrifice helped create someone like you, someone who helps other families the way she helped us. That night, Sarah called Rose to tell her about the conversation with Elena Rodriguez. "It's like ripples in a pond," Rose said. "One act of love creates waves that go farther than you ever imagined." Elena's mother's sacrifice helped her family, which enabled Elena to be stable enough to participate in your support group, which helps other families, which, well, who knows where it ends? It doesn't end, does it? Sarah realized. That's the point. Love in action just keeps going, creating more opportunities for love in action. Now you understand what your grandfather and I knew from the beginning, that the most valuable things we can leave behind aren't things at all. They're examples, patterns of generosity that get passed down and spread out until they've touched lives we'll never even know about. As Sarah prepared for bed that night in her small apartment, the first place she'd ever lived alone, paid for with the salary from a job made possible by an education funded partly by her grandmother's sacrifice, she thought about the weight of gratitude and how it could be transformed into action. The family emergency fund had grown to nearly $2,000, with contributions from all 4 family members. They hadn't needed to use it yet, but knowing it was there had changed the emotional climate of the household. Financial stress still existed, but the paralyzing fear of catastrophic crisis had been replaced by a more manageable anxiety about normal life challenges. More importantly, the conversation about money had become more open, more honest. Jake was learning about budgeting and saving, not as abstract concepts, but as practical skills for navigating an uncertain world. David had started talking about eventually pursuing additional training or certification that might make him less vulnerable to layoffs. Linda had begun exploring opportunities for advancement at her company, and Rose, rather than being treated as the elderly family member who needed protection from difficult topics, had become the family's financial advisor, the person whose hard-won wisdom about surviving economic uncertainty informed their planning and decision-making. Sarah opened her laptop and began working on a proposal she'd been developing for weeks. A program that would connect young professionals with elderly community members who had experienced financial hardship, creating mentorship relationships that benefited both generations. Young adults would gain practical wisdom about money management and resilience, while older adults would have opportunities to share their knowledge and experience in ways that felt valuable rather than burdensome. She tentatively titled the proposal the Rose Mitchell Memorial Fund for Intergenerational Financial Literacy, though she planned to change Rose's name to something more generic before submitting it officially. Still, she wanted her grandmother to know that her sacrifice had inspired something larger than just Sarah's individual success. As she typed, Sarah found herself thinking about all the families she would meet in her career. Families like her own, like the Rodriguezes, like countless others who were making quiet sacrifices and difficult choices in service of love and hope for the future. Each of them had their own version of Rose's story, their own moments of choosing generosity over security, their own examples of love made tangible through action. The real gift her grandmother had given her wasn't just the money that had saved their house. It was the understanding that individual security was an illusion, that real stability came from networks of mutual support, and that the most profound way to honor a sacrifice was to extend its impact to others who needed the same kind of help. Sarah saved her document and closed her laptop, but she didn't go to sleep immediately. Instead, she sat by her window, looking out at the lights of Chicago, millions of people in millions of homes, each carrying their own burdens and joys, each connected to others in ways they might not even recognize. Tomorrow, she would continue the work of helping families navigate crisis and find stability. She would advocate for policies that protected working people from the kinds of vulnerabilities her own family had faced. She would contribute to the emergency fund that represented her family's commitment to mutual support, and she would carry forward the example Rose had set, the understanding that love, when put into action, becomes a force that can change not just individual lives, but entire communities. The jewelry was gone, sold years ago to a dealer who had probably resold the pieces to other families, creating their own memories and traditions. But the love that had motivated that sale lived on, multiplied and magnified through every family Sarah helped, every crisis she assisted in resolving, every moment she chose generosity over self-protection. In the end, Sarah realized that was the true inheritance Rose had left her. Not money or possessions, but a way of being in the world that prioritized connection over security, love over fear, and the long-term well-being of the community over individual accumulation. It was an inheritance that could never be lost or stolen, that grew rather than diminished with use, and that would continue to generate returns long after the original investment had been forgotten by everyone except those whose lives had been changed by its power. As Sarah finally prepared for sleep, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding one's place in a larger story. A story of sacrifice and love that had begun long before her birth and would continue long after her death, connecting her to generations past and future through the simple but revolutionary act of choosing to help when help was needed, regardless of the personal cost. The hidden sacrifice had been revealed, but its true value lay not in the revelation, but in the commitment to honor it through a lifetime of similar choices. Small and large acts of generosity that would ripple outward through families and communities, creating the kind of world where Rose's sacrifice would no longer be necessary because mutual support would be built into the very fabric of how people cared for each other. That was the gift, and that was the responsibility. Sarah Mitchell, social worker, granddaughter, guardian of family stories and creator of new ones, was ready for both. 2 years had passed since Sarah's graduation, and the Chicago autumn painted the city in shades of amber and crimson that reminded her of the jewelry her grandmother had once worn. Sarah stood in the lobby of the newly opened Mitchell Center for Family Financial Resilience, watching as families filled the bright, welcoming space for the center's official opening ceremony. The center bore Rose's maiden name, a compromise Sarah had negotiated with the board of directors who wanted to honor the program's inspiration while maintaining the privacy Rose had insisted upon. "I don't need my name on a building," Rose had said when Sarah first proposed the idea, "but if it helps families, then use whatever name opens the most doors." Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the center's director and Sarah's former professor, approached with a clipboard and the slightly frazzled expression of someone managing a significant public event. "Sarah, Channel 7 wants to interview you in 10 minutes. Are you ready to talk about how the center came to be?" Sarah adjusted her blazer, the first piece of professional clothing she'd bought with her social work salary, a symbolic marker of her transition from struggling student to established professional. "As ready as I'll ever be." The center represented 18 months of grant writing, community partnerships, and tireless advocacy. What had started as Sarah's graduate school thesis project had evolved into a comprehensive program offering financial literacy classes, emergency microloans, and intergenerational mentorship opportunities. The program paired young adults facing financial challenges with older community members who had survived similar struggles, creating networks of support that extended far beyond traditional social services. "Sarah!" Jake's voice cut through the crowd as he approached with their parents and Rose. At 19, Jake had grown into his height and was now a sophomore at the local community college, studying business administration. He wore a tie for the occasion, a gesture of respect for the significance of the day. "How are you feeling?" Linda asked, reaching out to smooth an imaginary wrinkle in Sarah's jacket with the automatic gesture of a mother who would never stop seeing her daughter as someone who needed caring for. "Nervous," Sarah admitted. "This program will either help a lot of families or be a spectacular public failure." "It's going to help families," Rose said with the quiet confidence that had sustained her through decades of difficult decisions. "Because it comes from understanding what families actually need. not what bureaucrats think they need. Rose, now 80, moved more slowly than she had 2 years ago, but her mind remained sharp, and her involvement in the center's development had been crucial. She served on the advisory board and frequently spoke to the intergenerational mentorship groups about the practical realities of financial survival. David, wearing the suit he'd bought for Sarah's graduation and had worn to every important family event since, looked around the center with obvious pride. "I still can't believe our Sarah did all this." "Our Sarah had help," Sarah corrected gently. "From all of you, and from the community, and from a lot of people who believed this was important work." The local news interview went smoothly, with Sarah explaining the center's mission in terms that emphasized community resilience rather than individual charity. She'd learned to frame the conversation around mutual support and shared resources, avoiding language that might stigmatize the families seeking assistance. The Mitchell Center is based on the understanding that financial crisis can happen to anyone, she told the reporter. Job loss, medical emergencies, family changes. These aren't moral failures. They're life circumstances that require community response. Our programs help families build both practical skills and support networks that make them more resilient over time. After the interview, Sarah found herself in the center's main meeting room, where the first intergenerational mentorship session was about to begin. 12 young adults, ages 18 to 25, were seated across from 12 older community members, ages 60 to 85. The age range of mentors reflected Sarah's belief that wisdom about financial survival came from experience, not just formal education. "Welcome to our pilot mentorship program," Sarah addressed the group. "Over the next 6 months, you'll meet monthly to share experiences, strategies, and support around financial wellness. The goal isn't for older participants to lecture younger ones, but for both generations to learn from each other's perspectives." Among the younger participants was Maria Rodriguez, now 18 and about to start college, with a combination of grants, scholarships, and the Family Emergency Fund her parents had built with guidance from the center's financial literacy program. Her mentor was Mrs. Dorothy Washington, a 72-year-old retired teacher who had raised 5 children as a single mother and put all of them through college. "I want to start with a question for everyone," Sarah continued. "What's one financial lesson you learned from your family that you think would be helpful to share?" Maria raised her hand first. "My mom taught me that asking for help isn't shameful if you're willing to help others when you can. We got assistance when my dad was unemployed, and now we volunteer at the food bank because we know what it feels like to need help." Mrs. Washington nodded approvingly. "That's wisdom right there. My grandmother used to say that pride is expensive and community is free." She was right. A young man named Trevor, who was working 2 part-time jobs while taking classes at the community college, spoke up next. "My uncle taught me to always have 3 different plans for how to pay for something important. Like, if plan A falls through, you've already thought about plans B and C." His mentor, Mr. Frank Kowalski, a retired factory worker who'd survived 2 plant closures and multiple periods of unemployment, leaned forward with interest. "That's smart thinking. I learned something similar, but I called it the backup plan for the backup plan. Never put all your hopes in one basket." As the session continued, Sarah watched the connections forming between participants. The younger people brought energy and optimism tempered by realistic anxiety about their futures. The older participants brought hard-won wisdom and perspective that could only come from having survived decades of economic uncertainty. During a break, Rose approached Sarah with a cup of coffee and a thoughtful expression. "You know what I love about this?" Rose said, gesturing toward the animated conversations continuing around the room. "What's that?" "No one here is talking about charity or handouts. They're talking about strategies and community and mutual support. That's what was missing when I had to sell my jewelry. Not just the money, but the knowledge that other families had faced similar challenges and found ways through them." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came whenever Rose referenced her sacrifice so matter-of-factly. "Grandma, do you ever regret what you did? Selling the jewelry, I mean." Rose was quiet for a moment, watching Maria Rodriguez explain to Mrs. Washington how she planned to budget for college textbooks using a spreadsheet system she'd learned from her older brother. "Sarah, do you see that young woman over there? Maria?" Of course. 2 years ago, she was failing in school because she was staying up nights worrying about whether her family would be evicted. Today, she's mentoring other young people about financial planning and preparing to study social work herself because she wants to help families the way you helped hers. Yes, and do you see Mrs. Washington? Her husband died 3 years ago, and she's been struggling with loneliness and feeling like her life experiences don't matter anymore. Today, she's sharing wisdom that might change the trajectory of a young person's entire life. Rose turned to face Sarah directly. "My jewelry enabled your education, which led to your career, which created this center, which is now helping dozens of families build better futures, and it's creating connections between people who might otherwise never meet, let alone support each other." Sarah felt tears starting to blur her vision. "When you put it like that, when I put it like that, those rings and brooches look like the best investment I ever made." Your grandfather would have agreed. He always said the only wealth that really mattered was the wealth you created for other people. The afternoon session focused on practical skills, budgeting, saving strategies, understanding credit, and navigating emergency assistance programs. But the real learning was happening in the spaces between formal instruction, as participants shared stories and strategies that couldn't be found in any textbook. Jake, who had volunteered to help with technology support for the center's programs, was teaching some of the older participants how to use budgeting apps on their smartphones. Sarah watched her younger brother patiently explaining how to track expenses digitally, while Mrs. Washington showed him how to use an envelope system for cash management that had served her family for decades. "They're learning from each other," Dr. Hernandez observed, joining Sarah at the back of the room. The intergenerational component was brilliant. These aren't just classes, they're community building sessions. It was my grandmother's idea, actually. She said that wisdom without relationship is just information, but wisdom with relationship becomes transformation. As the day wound down, families began to leave with resource packets, contact information for their mentors or mentees, and something that Sarah recognized as hope, not the naive optimism that ignored real challenges, but the informed hope that came from understanding that problems could be solved and that support was available. Elena Rodriguez, Maria's mother, approached Sarah as she was cleaning up. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to thank you again, not just for helping our family, but for creating this place. Do you know what this reminds me of?" "What's that?" "When I was growing up in Mexico, we had what we called tandas, rotating savings groups where families would pool money and take turns receiving lump sums for major purchases or emergencies. It was like a community bank run by people who understood each other's struggles." Sarah felt a spark of recognition. That's exactly what we're trying to recreate here. Community-based financial support that comes from mutual understanding rather than institutional bureaucracy. Yes, but more than that. Those tandas weren't just about money. They were about relationships, about people who knew each other's children and celebrated each other's successes and helped during difficult times. That's what I see happening here. As Elena left with her family, Sarah found herself thinking about the evolution of her understanding since graduation day. What had started as a personal revelation about her grandmother's sacrifice had become a professional mission focused on systemic change. But at its core, it remained about the same thing: the ways people take care of each other when formal systems fail or fall short. That evening, the Mitchell family gathered at Rose's house for their weekly dinner, a tradition that had grown to include Jake's girlfriend Emma and occasionally other extended family members or friends who needed community. The kitchen table that had once been the site of whispered conversations about financial crisis was now the center of celebrations and planning sessions for future dreams. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," David said as they shared Rose's famous lasagna. "But more than that, I'm proud of how you've taken something painful from our family's past and turned it into something helpful for other families." "It wasn't painful," Rose interjected gently. "It was necessary, and now it's useful. That's the best outcome any difficult decision can have." Jake, who had been unusually quiet during dinner, suddenly spoke up. "I've been thinking about changing my major." The conversation stopped as everyone turned to look at him. "From business to what?" Linda asked. "Social work, actually. Or maybe non-profit management. I want to work with programs like the Center, helping families build financial stability." He looked around the table, his expression serious but determined. "I mean, I've seen firsthand how much difference this kind of work can make, and I've learned more about real financial management from watching our family than I ever would in a business classroom." Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. "Jake, social work doesn't pay very well, especially at the beginning. You need to be realistic about..." "About what?" "About choosing meaningful work over a big salary. About prioritizing community service over individual wealth accumulation." Jake's voice carried a maturity that reminded Sarah how much her younger brother had grown since learning about their family's financial struggles. "Sarah, you've shown me that success isn't about how much money you make, it's about how much positive impact you have. But you also need to be able to support yourself and eventually a family," David pointed out, his voice carrying the concern of a man who had experienced the stress of financial insecurity. "Which is why programs like Sarah's Center matter so much," Jake replied. "If we build better community support systems, individual families don't have to carry all the risk alone. Besides, our family emergency fund is proof that you don't need a huge income to build financial stability if you're strategic about it." The family emergency fund had grown to over $5,000, contributed to by all family members and used twice. Once when Rose needed unexpected dental work, and once when David's car required major repairs. Each time, the fund had been replenished within 3 months through collective effort. "I support whatever makes you happy," Rose said, her voice carrying the authority of the family matriarch. "But I also want you to understand something important. The goal of financial stability isn't money for its own sake. It's freedom. Freedom to make choices based on your values rather than just your immediate needs." "That's exactly what I want," Jake replied. "The freedom to choose work that matters." As the evening continued, Sarah found herself marveling at the ripple effects of Rose's original sacrifice. Not only had it enabled Sarah's education and career, but it had fundamentally changed how their family talked about money, work, and community responsibility. Jake's decision to pursue social work represented a generational shift toward prioritizing social impact over individual accumulation, a luxury made possible by the financial literacy and community support systems the family had developed. Later, as Sarah helped Rose clean up the kitchen, her grandmother brought up a topic they'd been discussing intermittently for months. "I've been thinking about that interview request from the newspaper," Rose said, referring to a Chicago Tribune reporter who wanted to write a feature story about the center and its founding inspiration. "You don't have to do it if you're not comfortable." "Actually, I think I want to. Not for the attention, but because our story might help other families understand that financial crisis isn't shameful and that intergenerational support isn't a burden, it's a strength." Sarah paused in wiping down the counter. "Are you sure? Once it's in the newspaper, everyone will know about the jewelry, about Dad's layoff, about all of it." "Sarah, sweetheart, I'm 80 years old. I've spent enough of my life worrying about what other people think. If our family's story helps even one grandmother realize that sacrificing for her grandchildren's education is an investment worth making, or helps one young person understand that accepting help is part of building community, then it's worth whatever embarrassment might come with it." Rose moved to the window, that looked out over her small backyard, where tomatoes still grew despite the approaching winter, testament to her refusal to let age prevent her from planning for future harvests. Besides, she continued, I've learned something from watching the center develop. Individual stories become powerful when they're connected to larger movements for change. Our story isn't just about our family anymore. It's about how families can support each other through economic uncertainty. Sarah joined her grandmother at the window, both women looking out at the garden that had fed the family through countless meals, provided herbs for home remedies, and served as a metaphor for roses. Approach to life. Plant what you can, tend it carefully, and trust that the harvest will come in its own time. The reporter wants to focus on the sacrifice angle, Sarah said. The grandmother who gave up everything for her granddaughter's education. Then we'll give her a different angle, Rose replied firmly. The grandmother who made an investment in her family's future that paid returns she never could have imagined. The family that learned to transform crisis into opportunity. The community that discovered that financial wellness is a collective responsibility. As Sarah drove home that night, she thought about how stories shape understanding, and how the narrative around her family's experience had evolved from shame and secrecy to pride and advocacy. The center was thriving, Jake was finding his own path toward meaningful work, and Rose was preparing to share their story publicly as an example of resilience rather than victimhood. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah was beginning to see her grandmother's sacrifice not as a burden to be repaid, but as a foundation to be built upon, a starting point for creating the kind of community where such individual sacrifices would become less necessary because mutual support would be woven into the very fabric of how people cared for each other. The hidden sacrifice had become a public inspiration, the family's secret had become a community resource, and the pain of financial crisis had been transformed into a platform for systemic change. It was exactly the kind of return on investment that Rose had imagined when she'd walked into that jewelry store 2 years ago, carrying pieces of her past to purchase pieces of her family's future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, families facing eviction, young people struggling with student debt, elderly community members choosing between medication and groceries. But tonight, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that individual pain had been transformed into collective healing, that private struggles had become public resources, and that the love that had motivated one elderly woman's sacrifice was now multiplying itself through dozens of families learning to support each other through whatever difficulties lay ahead. The center would open its doors again tomorrow, ready to welcome new families, facilitate new connections, and demonstrate once again that the most powerful financial resource any community possesses is not money in the bank, but people willing to invest in each other's success. It was Rose's legacy in motion, spreading outward like ripples in a pond, touching lives that would never know the name of the woman whose sacrifice had made their support possible. And that, Sarah realized, was exactly how Rose would have wanted it.